Michael Irons, Worlds Old and New, by Nathan Moore. Chapter 12, Under the Hill. The height of Michael Irons, while not extraordinary, was greater than average, and in the mind's eye his wolfish form reared larger still by the force of his implacable bearing, not with mere confidence but calm certainty and decades of bloody experience. His cold blue eyes ever even and aloof. Thus, when the forms about him stood at their tallest only to the base of his breastbone, his slender figure became strongly juxtaposed against the 24 squat, hunched figures which now hurriedly escorted him, small, black, piggish eyes darting about, furtive, as if at any moment they might be set upon. No enemy or danger appeared, and Irons was pushed and prodded into a cave hidden beneath an innocuous hill. Upon the green lands above, these small pygmy kind had appeared colored as ash or soot, as if each were the remains of a campfire given form and will. Yet so crafty and quiet were they that even Irons had been taken completely unaware, bound and captured before he was able to draw blade or pistol, then made in short order to scurry among their ranks on hobbled feet. Now, below, within their low, stifled tunnels, each figure of this strange and stunted people seemed to vanish from sight, as if melded into the soil of the walls and shadows. Soon thereafter, all surface light was lost, and Irons found himself hurried, harried, and pushed deeper and deeper into a rabbit warren of caves and caverns. The small folk remained in silence, seemingly undeterred by the utter darkness. There was a grunted word here, a short phrase there, and now it seemed as though the voices came within a slightly larger room and were more numerous, and Irons found he did not need to stoop so low. Around Irons came soft chittering and whispers, none of which he could even begin to understand, and still he was forced forward, always down, until the air grew tight and cold. Perhaps there were fewer warm bodies here than he had assumed. He also noted a curious absence of the aroma which invariably rose from tight living conditions. Now there emerged the faintest hint of light, ahead, then around, a green-blue fluorescence, a natural algae, it seemed to Irons. One inclined towards the ceiling, but was further grown and tended to coax it downward to frame larger passageways. Even in this strange light, his captors were scarcely discerned, apart from a movement here or the glint of black eyes there. Within the hushed shuffle and hardly breathed words, Michael Irons was further guided down. There was a new light ahead, a greater light that fell upon him with comparative intensity, and with such sudden abruptness that Irons attempted to throw up his bound hands to shield his eyes. The soot-skinned pygmies sometimes seemed to have donned thick canvas over their heads to shield their small black eyes, further directing these down rather than forward. Even so adorned, they seemed to wince and flinch from the light. If this was such a bane to their eyes and bodies, wondered Irons, why had they risked daylight exposure to seize him? Perhaps he had wandered just close enough to their dwelling and they had not needed to venture far beyond their hidden doorstep. Before Irons was now a great slab of rock, upon which could be seen, with some effort in the glare of light, ancient pictographs, cut deep and colored. Stood before this slab was a pygmy of peculiar appearance, more gnarled and thin than the others, his soot-colored skin darker and blotted and wrinkled. This elder, as Irons assumed him to be, was leaned upon an impossibly thin staff, formed of wood from no tree Irons could identify. Despite its narrow girth, still the slender twig did not bend or crack or make sounds of protest, and Irons wondered if this spoke of the wood's strength, the pygmy elder's smallness, or perhaps both. Irons was prodded forward toward the elder by a small guard of 6 of the ashen pygmies, themselves armed with simple lengths of wood sharpened into spears, and now Irons began to suspect, given that they were allowing him so close to a figure he presumed to carry importance, that there had been a need behind his capture. As this thought came to him, the elder Ashen lifted a shriveled arm, little more than sinew, bone, and skin, and pointed a finger to the pictographs, then beyond toward the light, which seemed to somehow emanate from a larger hole behind the engraved stone. Irons first inspected the adorned stab as directed, and found images of persons who he assumed to be the Ashen fighting. Other larger figures also fought. Against these images was a great beast, its form oddly indistinct, as if obscured, but still dominated by a great maw which devoured all comers. Pictographs the world over, Irons had found, conveyed a story well but lacked a certain specificity. He looked to the ledge the elder had pointed toward next, holding a hand against the glare of light. Beneath and farther down than he had expected, Irons could see an array of strange mineral deposits from which the light emanated. Now that his eyes had been given time to adjust and there was not a contrast with darkness, he could see well enough, though the intensity still prompted his eyes to flinch and water. Then he saw this was not merely a tunnel but seemed to open into a cavern, and therein were, as he had presumed from the images on the slab, bones, but the numerous quantity he had not expected. New bones, old bones, all scattered about, shoved against the walls in tall piles like snowdrifts. Most bones were thin and oddly proportioned, which he presumed were those of the Ashen, but some bones were typical of humans, and Irons thought of the other figures in the pictograph. Some weapons there were as well, most being the stick spears of the Ashen, but Irons also saw more familiar bows and arrows and tomahawks and knives near the human skeletons, inferring the weapons and bones had belonged to members of some roaming tribesmen who had likely been captured in the same manner as Irons. Again, Irons looked to the elder, who pointed toward him, then gestured down. The half-dozen guards kept their spears pointed toward Irons' chest, but he did not feel particularly menaced. Ritual combat? Or perhaps a sacrifice? Though the Ashen had not taken his weapons, he looked back toward the tunnel from which they had come. There seemed to be many figures within the tunnel's confines, but while they watched, anxious, there did not seem to be the intensity or fervor of an arena, nor the murmured energy of a religious observance. Perhaps this was not entertainment, but therein was a monster that needed to be defeated. Perhaps there were still details he could not now, nor would ever, discern. Regardless of motive, it seemed to Irons that the Ashen had captured him so he might combat whatever creature resided within this glowing grotto. Unhappy, but with no alternative, Irons inspected the descent into the grotto once more, identified a proportion that seemed to at least be somewhat of an incline rather than a sheer face, and began a careful descent, picking his way down slowly by fitting toes and fingers into and upon small nooks and protrusions. A small cadre of Ashen watched silently from above through their protective burlap masks. The elder seemed to mutter something and made an obscure gesture, whether of benediction, protection, or a prayer of offering, Irons did not know. Once he reached the bottom, Irons grasped the first knife he could and severed his bonds. The floor of the illuminated grotto beyond the skeletons was made of fine sand, so fine as to be considered more similar to a powder, and Michael Irons began to suspect that, while some of it was gravel and sand, a good proportion was also powdered bone. With a deep breath to clear his mind from the turmoil and consternation of his abrupt capture and this duty forced upon him, he drew out both flintlock pistols from beneath his black cloak and began to stalk into the cavern in search of whatever beast it was the Ashen feared so. It occurred to Irons that perhaps they did not fear the beast. Perhaps they revered it and honored it with sacrifice by combat. Perhaps it did not even require food or water. After all, it seemed to have been down here long enough to produce all those bones. But also... Irons pursed his lips, his already dour features growing darker as he tried to recollect the pictograph. The cavern opened and yawned wide before Irons. There was a small lake to his left, while to his right the flat white sands continued, skeletons sometimes propped against the wall, and Irons wondered why so many were piled up at the entrance. Perhaps the majority of combatants had fled there either to attempt escape or to make use of the narrower confines. The shining mineral veins were here as well, and the scope of the cavern did nothing to diminish the ferocity of the light. But Irons forced himself to walk without shielding his eyes so he could survey his surroundings unhindered. As if on cue, Michael Irons noticed a form at the other end of the grotto. It was not near the far wall that still lay somewhat beyond his sight. Now, within the aura of white light before him stood a separate concentration of white. Caution and experience prompted him to presume this to be the beast. A wash of realization inspired in Irons pity for the poor pygmy Ashen. With their sensitive eyes accustomed to darkness like a bat or mole, this environment would leave them blind, rendering this beast virtually invisible. Perhaps they could not see it even when seized upon. Regardless, the human skeletal remains and their respective weapons still meant that the creature was dreadfully dangerous. With but a single look of hesitation to inspect the black-clad intruder, his tall, lithe form stark and brazen against the white light and sand, the beast charged without a bellow. Swiftly it closed the distance, bringing into sudden focus that it was indeed immense. Its frame the size and form of the bison Irons had seen roam the New World's plains. But there the resemblance ended, and its legs and arms seemed more akin to that of a monstrous gorilla, but with paws like a bear's, wide and round and clawed. And the face. The beast's face yawned in a great maw, wide like a bear, long like a wolf, the skull which seemed to strain against the skin, protruding even, as if it were ready to leap away from the body. Within this mess, its deep-set eyes bulged black from the near-exposed sockets, and its teeth gnashed against one another, some seeming crocodile, some bear, some wolf, some lizard. And all of this seemed to jut away from the polar bear white fur, heaped upon an enormous hump of body. It looked less like a natural creature and more the deranged assembly of a madman. Irons took careful aim with his left pistol, fired, then raised the right, and fired directly after. The two ball shots impacted so near as to all but stack upon one another. Blood erupted from the beast, which tossed its head about as if maddened, yet despite the action of its neck and jaw it remained utterly silent, apart from its great footfalls upon the fine white sand. Irons could not tell how much damage he had dealt, and was forced to dodge with all his might away from the enraged beast. But unlike the hooves of bison or bull, the strange bear-like paws allowed the beast a degree of unexpected maneuverability, and Irons found his cape and left sleeve entrapped in the tossing maw. The mess of fabric kept his arm from immediate damage. Irons' greatsword sang free from its sheath, and with as much force as he was able, Irons brought the blade down upon the strange skull, but the sword rebounded as if it had struck stone, and the silent creature, even its great breaths near unheard, turned baleful, maddened eyes to gaze upon its trapped prey. It reached at him with freakish, unnatural arms, and Irons leapt into the beast's grasp, stabbing and plunging the blade into the beast's neck, angling down into its torso, intending arteries and, with luck, the heart. A great gout of blood erupted from the wound, signaling success, and the beast reared back in a silent roar, relinquishing its hold, casting Irons away. Irons rolled to his feet, absent his sword which remained in the beast's neck, drawing instead his colonial hunting knife, and, with a growing sense of dread he could hardly stifle, Irons watched as the beast turned on both hind legs and looked down upon him, seemingly unaffected by the gargantuan wound which had already turned half its coat red and left a great swath of sand stained crimson. It dropped to all fours, already in a full run, and it was on him in a moment. Irons turned in a dodge, knowing he could not escape the uncanny paws, but intent on at least keeping himself from the maw. He managed this, if only just, and as the great weight bore down, the gorilla-like embrace about to pulverize his ribs like kindling, Irons plunged his hunting knife into the white beast's broad eye socket. The beast went stiff in an instant, the savage reaction throwing Irons away yet again, where he scrambled, now entirely unarmed, his eyes casting about for sight of a skeleton with a weapon, or even an available rib. But it was unnecessary. The beast's form remained stiff for several moments, then its neck numbly flexed and turned as its teeth clenched, while its strange arms and legs seemed to try and paw the air for purchase. The death throes cast it onto its side grew less and eventually ceased. The stiffness eased, and the sand before the beast's maw was no longer buffeted by its breath. Irons reloaded his pistols before daring an approach. He first retrieved his weapons, then cleaned them with the beast's thick, disturbingly luxurious fur. A longer examination of the beast puzzled Irons even further, for it had been fallen by mortal means, yet it seemed distinctly unnatural. Irons could not fathom how it had come to be, nor why it was here, and the pygmy Ashen's ancient relation to it left him overwhelmed with questions. Yet he knew there would be no answers. Irons returned to the grotto's entrance, taking a moment to examine the glowing minerals on the way, but these too remained inscrutable. He took a few on a whim. He climbed up from the cavern where he was met by the silent Ashen. Then, after a long moment, the elder made a motion to two of the guards. These gestured Irons to come close. Then they took his hands and led him away from the grotto, back through their warrens and out into the wider world. For a moment, Irons made a great sigh of relief, glad he could see so far and feel the wind once more. When he turned around, there was naught but an innocuous hillside behind. He returned to the camp where he was taken to find his belongings just as he had left them. Irons took his pack upon his shoulders and continued his journey once more.